The dust of Millfield settled like a shroud over the weathered buildings as the sun blazed mercilessly overhead. It was the kind of heat that made even the hardiest souls seek shelter. But Samuel "Sam" Weatherby sat motionless on his horse at the edge of town, his weathered hands gripping the reins with the same steady resolve that had carried him through 40 years of frontier life. At 62, Sam was a relic of a bygone era. His face, carved by wind and sun into deep lines, told stories of cattle drives, Indian wars, and the gradual taming of the wild frontier. His grey beard hung unkempt, and his clothes bore the dust of countless miles. Most folks in Millfield saw him as nothing more than a broken-down old cowboy, clinging to outdated notions of honor and chivalry in a world that had moved past such foolishness. The commotion erupted from the direction of the saloon. Shouts, the sound of splintering wood and a woman's terrified scream cut through the afternoon air like a knife. Sam's horse, a grizzled Mustang named Thunder, shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing his rider's tension. "Help me. Please, someone help me." The voice was young, desperate, and filled with pure terror. 3 rough-looking men emerged from the Silver Dollar Saloon, dragging a young woman between them. She couldn't have been more than 19, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight despite her dire circumstances. Her simple blue dress was torn at the sleeve, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt. "Come on, darling," sneered the largest of the 3, a bear of a man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Boss Johnson's waiting for you back at camp, and he doesn't like to be kept waiting." "I told you. I don't know anything about your stolen money," she cried, struggling against their grip. "My father never stole anything from anyone." The crowd that had gathered kept a safe distance. Millfield had learned long ago that interfering with Boss Johnson's men was a quick way to end up face down in the desert. The townsfolk watched with the passive resignation of people who had seen too much violence and learned to look the other way. Sam urged Thunder forward, the horse's hooves echoing against the hard-packed earth. Every eye turned toward him as he approached, some with curiosity, others with the weary recognition of trouble brewing. "That's far enough, old man," called out the second outlaw, a wiry fellow with nervous eyes and quick hands that hovered near his gun belt. "This ain't your concern." Sam dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate despite his age. "Any man with eyes can see the girl's in distress," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down worse men than these. "Seems to me like she doesn't want to go with you." The scarred leader laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the ears. "You hear that, boys? The old codger thinks he's some kind of hero." He spat into the dust. "This here's business, Grandpa. The girl's daddy owes our boss a considerable debt, and she's our insurance policy." "My father's been dead for 3 months," the girl sobbed. "I don't owe anyone anything." "Debts don't die with the debtor, sweetheart," the third man chimed in, his voice oily and unpleasant. "Now, old-timer, you best climb back on that nag of yours and ride on out of here before things get unpleasant." The crowd murmured nervously. Mayor Hutchins, a portly man in an expensive suit, stepped forward slightly. "Sam, maybe you should listen to them. These men work for Boss Johnson, and you know what that means." "I know exactly what that means," Sam replied, never taking his eyes off the 3 outlaws. "It means they think they can ride into a decent town and terrorize innocent folks without consequence." "Innocent?" The scarred man's laugh was bitter. "Her daddy stole $5,000 from our operation before he got himself killed in that mine collapse. Far as we're concerned, that debt passes to his kin." Sam's hand moved to rest on the grip of his Colt 45, the movement subtle but unmistakable. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, taking a woman against her will ain't the way civilized men handle their business. "Civilized?" The wiry outlaw's voice pitched higher with incredulous laughter. "Old man, you've been out in the sun too long. This is 1889, not some fairy tale about knights and princesses." The girl's eyes found Sam's, and in them he saw not just fear but a desperate hope that someone, anyone, might stand up for what was right. It was a look he remembered from his own daughter's face years ago, before the fever took her and his wife in the same terrible winter. "Let her go," Sam said quietly, but his words carried across the silent street with absolute finality. "She's done nothing wrong, and I won't stand by and watch you drag her off to whatever hell Boss Johnson has planned." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The 3 outlaws exchanged glances, clearly not having expected resistance from what they'd assumed was just another scared townsperson. "You're making a big mistake, old man," the scarred leader growled, his hand moving toward his weapon. Boss Johnson's got 20 men in those hills, and they don't take kindly to interference. Maybe so, Sam nodded calmly. But right here, right now, it's just you three and me, and that girl's not leaving with you today. The crowd began to back away, sensing violence in the air. Someone whispered urgently about fetching the sheriff, but Sheriff McKenna was 3 days' ride away in the county seat, and everyone knew it. "Sam, don't be a fool," called out Mrs. Henderson from the general store. "Think about what you're doing." "I am thinking," Sam replied, his eyes never leaving the outlaws. "I'm thinking about what kind of man I am, and what kind of town this is supposed to be." The girl had stopped struggling, watching this weathered stranger with amazement. No one had stood up for her since her father's death. No one had even tried. "Last chance, Grandpa," the scarred man snarled, his patience clearly at an end. "Walk away, or we'll put you in the ground right here in front of all these good people." Sam's weathered hand tightened on his gun grip. "I've been buried by better men than you, son. Question is, are you ready to find out if you're one of them?" The silence stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. In that moment, suspended between heartbeats, the fate of one young woman, and perhaps the soul of an entire town, hung in the balance. The scarred outlaw's hand moved like lightning toward his gun, but 40 years of survival had taught Sam Weatherby to read the signs. His Colt cleared leather in a smooth, practiced motion that spoke of countless hours of training and more gunfights than he cared to remember. The first shot echoed through Millfield like thunder, sending horses rearing and townsfolk diving for cover. The scarred man stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, his weapon spinning uselessly in the dust. Sam's second shot came before the echo of the first had faded, taking the wiry outlaw in the leg and dropping him to his knees. The third man, seeing his companions down, released the girl and went for his gun with desperate fury. But age had brought Sam wisdom along with slower reflexes. Instead of trying to outdraw the younger man, he rolled behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood above his head. "You crazy old fool," the remaining outlaw screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "You've killed us all. Boss Johnson will burn this whole town down." The girl, freed from her captor's grip, scrambled toward the shelter of the general store. Mrs. Henderson, despite her earlier protests, pulled the terrified young woman inside, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. Sam rose from behind the trough, his Colt trained on the last standing outlaw. "Drop your weapon, son. Your friends need a doctor, and this doesn't have to end with anyone dead." "Go to hell, old man." The outlaw's shot went wide, his aim spoiled by fear and rage. Sam's return shot was precise, taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The outlaw's gun fell from nerveless fingers, and he collapsed beside his companions, all three now wounded but alive. The street fell silent except for the groans of the injured men and the distant sound of wind through the buildings. Sam kept his weapon drawn as he approached the three outlaws, kicking their guns well out of reach. "Someone fetch Doc Morrison," he called out, not taking his eyes off the wounded men. "And get some rope. These boys are going to need restraining until the sheriff can deal with them properly." But instead of gratitude or admiration, the voices that rose from the crowd carried disappointment and anger. "Sam, what have you done?" Mayor Hutchins emerged from behind a hitching post, his face pale and drawn. "Do you have any idea what you've brought down on us?" "He saved that girl," protested Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, but his voice lacked conviction. "Saved her?" scoffed Gerald Morrison, the banker. "He's condemned us all. Boss Johnson's got an army up in those hills, and now they'll come for the whole town." Doc Morrison, a thin man with kind eyes, hurried forward with his medical bag. He began tending to the wounded outlaws without comment, but Sam could see the concern etched in every line of his weathered face. The girl emerged from the general store, her dress still torn but her spine straight, with newfound dignity. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one stood up for me since my father died. I'm Grace Patterson." "Sam Weatherby," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Your daddy was the miner who died in the collapse?" She nodded, tears threatening again. "He was a good man, Mr. Weatherby. He never stole anything from anyone. These men, they've been hunting me for weeks, claiming he owed them money. I've been sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings trying to stay ahead of them." "Well, you don't have to run anymore, miss," Sam said gently. "At least not today." "Today?" Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, his voice rising with indignation. "Sam, this won't end today. Boss Johnson's operation controls half the territory between here and the Mexican border. You think 3 wounded men are going to stop him?" The crowd murmured its agreement, their fear palpable. Sam could see it in their faces, the calculation, the weighing of one girl's safety against their own security. Maybe Sam should take the girl and leave town, suggested Clara Webb, the schoolteacher. Let Boss Johnson know we had nothing to do with this. That's a fine idea, agreed Jeremiah Hastings, who owned the feed store. No offense, Sam, but you've lived your life. Some of us have families to think about. Grace's face went white at the suggestion. Please, she whispered. I have nowhere else to go. This is the only home I've ever known. Sam felt the familiar weight of loneliness that had been his constant companion since his wife and daughter's deaths. He saw the same isolation in Grace's eyes, the terrible understanding that the world could be a cold and uncaring place. The girl stays, he said firmly, and so do I. Damn it, Sam, Mayor Hutchins exploded. You can't make that decision for all of us. This is bigger than your outdated sense of chivalry. Chivalry. The word was spat out by Pete Morrison, the banker's son. This isn't some dime novel, old man. This is real life, where real people die for stupid gestures. What's stupid about protecting the innocent? Sam asked quietly. Everything, Pete shot back. When the cost is everyone else's life, you think Boss Johnson cares about your noble intentions? He'll ride in here with his whole gang and burn Millfield to the ground. Doc Morrison looked up from bandaging the scarred outlaw's shoulder. These men need to be moved to my office, he said diplomatically. We can continue this discussion later. As volunteers reluctantly came forward to help carry the wounded outlaws, the conversations continued in hushed, angry tones. Sam caught fragments of the discussions swirling around him. Always was a stubborn fool, living in the past. What right does he have? Should have minded his own business. Grace moved closer to Sam, her voice low and urgent. Mr. Weatherby, maybe they're right. Maybe I should leave. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me. Sam studied her face, seeing strength beneath the fear. Miss Patterson, do you know why your father supposedly owed Boss Johnson money? She shook her head. My father worked honest jobs his whole life. Mining, some cattle work, whatever he could find. We never had much, but we never owed anyone either. Then someone's lying, Sam said simply. And I found that men who lie about money usually lie about everything else too. As the wounded outlaws were carried away, Mayor Hutchins approached Sam with a grim expression. Sam, I'm going to ask you one more time. Take the girl and leave Millfield, tonight, before this gets any worse. And if I refuse, then you're on your own. The town council will meet tonight, and I can guarantee they'll vote to ask you both to leave. We can't protect you, and we won't sacrifice everyone else for your principles. Sam nodded slowly, understanding the position they were in, but unable to accept it. I reckon that's your right, Mayor. Just like it's my right to do what I think is correct. As the crowd dispersed, Sam could hear the whispered conversations continuing. The words fool, reckless, and selfish followed him like shadows, but it was Grace's quiet voice that cut through all the noise. Why? She asked simply. Why risk everything for someone you don't even know? Sam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains where Boss Johnson's men waited. Because, Miss Patterson, sometimes a man has to decide what kind of person he wants to be, and I decided long ago that I'd rather be a fool who stood up than a wise man who looked away. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Somewhere in those hills, Sam knew, Boss Johnson was already planning his response. The town was right about one thing. This was far from over. But as he looked at Grace Patterson's face, saw the gratitude and hope there despite everything, Sam Weatherby knew he had made the only choice he could live with, even if it might be the last choice he ever made. The oil lamp flickered in Sam's modest ranch house as evening settled over the valley. 5 miles outside Millfield, the small homestead sat surrounded by rolling hills and scrub brush. Grace Patterson sat at the rough table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, still processing the day's events. Your father teach you about cattle? Sam asked, noting her skill with the evening chores. He worked ranches before mining, Grace replied, a sad smile crossing her face. Said cattle were honest work. They didn't lie or cheat you, just needed care and attention. She paused, studying Sam's weathered face. He would have liked you, Mr. Weatherby. Said there were 2 kinds of men, those who did what was easy and those who did what was right. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind through the cottonwoods outside. In the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another across the valley. They'll come tonight, won't they? Grace asked quietly. Sam nodded. Boss Johnson's not the type to let a challenge go unanswered. He's got 20, maybe 25 men, all hard cases. Grace looked around the simple cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the photographs on the mantel of a woman and young girl. You could still leave. Take me somewhere far from here. Running's not in my nature, miss. Besides, Boss Johnson's got connections all through the territory. He'd find us eventually. Sam studied her carefully. Something about Grace didn't fit her simple story. Her speech was too refined, her mannerisms too polished for a poor miner's daughter. Grace, he said carefully, tell me about your mother. Her face went pale, and she set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. She died when I was young. Papa never liked talking about her. What was her name? Catherine Patterson, Grace whispered. Sam reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn, yellowed letter. I got this in 1879 from a woman named Catherine Whitman, asking about her husband's death. Said he'd been killed in a mining accident, but she suspected it wasn't accidental. Grace's eyes widened as she recognized the elegant handwriting. That's my mother's writing. Your mother was Catherine Whitman, daughter of Colonel James Whitman, Civil War hero and territorial governor. Your father wasn't just Thomas Patterson. He was Thomas Whitman, the colonel's son, who deserted from the army in 1871. Grace stared in shock. That's impossible. Your father deserted because he couldn't stomach the army's treatment of the Apache. Colonel Whitman disowned him, said he'd rather have a dead son than a coward. Thomas took your mother's maiden name and disappeared into the wilderness. How do you know all this? Sam refolded the letter carefully. I served under Colonel Whitman during the war. Thomas was just a boy then, but I knew him. When your mother wrote asking about his death, I investigated. He paused, watching her face. Your grandfather died 3 years ago, leaving everything to his son, or his children if Thomas was dead. That inheritance includes mineral rights to half this territory, including your father's silver mine. You're saying I inherited about $500,000 in mining rights and property, Sam confirmed. Boss Johnson knew your father found something valuable in that mine. When the cave-in happened, he figured he could claim it all. If there was no heir to dispute ownership, the implications hit Grace like a physical blow. He killed my father, made it look like an accident. Most likely, Sam nodded grimly, and now he's trying to eliminate the only person who can challenge his claim to the Whitman estate. Grace's hands shook as the truth settled over her. All this time I thought I was nobody, just a poor girl with nothing left in the world. You're somebody, Miss Whitman. Your grandfather may have been a hard man, but the Whitman name still carries weight in this territory. The distant thunder of hoofbeats reached their ears. Sam rose and extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. They're coming, he said quietly, checking his rifle. Stay low, and remember, you're still a Whitman. That name means something in this territory. Through the window they could see torches bobbing in the darkness, 20 riders approaching in a wide line. Boss Johnson had brought his entire gang. Samuel Weatherby, the voice carried across the night air. Send out the girl, and maybe we'll let you live. Sam positioned himself at the window. Grace, there's a root cellar behind the stove. Get down there and stay hidden. I won't leave you to face them alone, Grace said with surprising determination. How you will if you want to honor your father's memory, Sam replied firmly. He died protecting you. Don't make his sacrifice meaningless. As Grace reluctantly made her way to the cellar, Sam called out into the darkness. She's under my protection, Johnson. You want her, you'll have to go through me. Cold laughter answered. That can be arranged, old man. Boys, burn him out. The first torch arced toward the cabin roof, but Sam's rifle barked and it fell harmlessly to the ground. His second and third shots scattered the riders, but there were too many of them. As the siege began, Sam Weatherby prepared for what he was certain would be his final stand. He had no way of knowing that 12 miles away, a column of riders was moving through the darkness, guided by a message that had traveled faster than any horse. At their head rode a man whose face bore a striking resemblance to both Grace and the late Colonel James Whitman, a man who had been searching for his missing niece for 3 long years. The siege had lasted 3 hours when the first torch finally found its mark. Sam watched helplessly as flames began to lick at the corner of his roof, the dry wood catching quickly in the night air. Boss Johnson's men had grown bolder as the hours passed, creeping closer under cover of darkness. Weatherby, Johnson's voice carried across the yard, filled with cruel satisfaction. You're burning out, old man. Send out the girl now, and we'll make it quick. Sam fired another shot from his dwindling ammunition, keeping the outlaws at bay for the moment. In the root cellar, Grace huddled in the darkness, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the man who had risked everything for her, slowly losing his final battle. "I won't let you die for me," she whispered, rising from her hiding place despite Sam's orders. "Get back down there," Sam commanded without turning from the window. "This isn't your fight anymore." "Yes, it is," Grace said firmly, picking up his spare rifle. "I'm done running, I'm done hiding. If I'm really a Whitman, then it's time I acted like one." The flames were spreading now, filling the cabin with smoke. Sam coughed harshly, his eyes watering as he tried to maintain his position. Outside, he could hear Johnson's men laughing and calling out taunts. "Time's up, old fool! Come out with your hands up or burn alive!" Sam looked at Grace, seeing the determination in her eyes, the steel that had skipped a generation but was unmistakably present. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. It was then that they heard it, a sound that made Boss Johnson's laughter die in his throat, the thunder of hoofbeats, not from 20 horses, but from many times that number. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of Millfield, until the very ground seemed to shake with their approach. "What the hell?" Johnson's voice cut off as the first riders crested the hill. They came like an avalanche of justice, 100 mounted men in formation, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. At their head rode a tall man in a colonel's uniform, his bearing unmistakably military despite his civilian status. Behind him came cavalry veterans, Texas Rangers, federal marshals, and armed citizens from 3 counties over. Boss Johnson's gang, caught completely off guard, scrambled for their horses, but the newcomers had them surrounded before they could mount a proper escape. The night erupted in gunfire, but it was over almost before it began. Outnumbered 5-1 and trapped in the open, Johnson's men threw down their weapons in surrender. The tall man dismounted and strode through the smoke toward the burning cabin. "Grace," he called out, "Grace Whitman." Sam and Grace emerged from the cabin, Sam supporting the young woman who was overcome with shock and emotion. The man who approached them had Grace's eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Uncle Robert?" Grace whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Colonel Robert Whitman, younger brother of the late territorial governor, swept his niece into his arms. "I've been searching for you for 3 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Ever since I learned that Thomas might have had a daughter." "How did you find me?" Grace asked, clinging to the uncle she had never known existed. "A telegram," Robert replied, looking towards Sam with profound respect. "Sent from Millfield this afternoon by a woman named Mrs. Henderson. She said an old cowboy was risking his life to protect someone who might be my missing niece." Sam blinked in surprise. Mrs. Henderson, who had pulled Grace to safety, who had later criticized his actions, she had sent for help. "She described what you'd told Grace about Thomas and Catherine," Robert continued. "About the letter, about Colonel Whitman's will. I knew immediately it had to be you, Grace. I brought every man I could gather, federal marshals from Santa Fe, rangers from Texas, cavalry veterans who served under your grandfather." Boss Johnson, bleeding from a shoulder wound and bound with ropes, was dragged before them. His face was a mask of fury and defeat. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled at Sam. "That mine was worthless. I invested everything in equipment, in men, in working that claim. When it produced nothing, I needed someone to blame, someone to pay. So you murdered Thomas Whitman and tried to steal his inheritance," Colonel Whitman said coldly, "including mineral rights that belonged to his daughter." "The mine was played out," Johnson protested. "There was no silver worth speaking of." "Perhaps not," Robert smiled grimly, "but the mineral rights extend far beyond that single mine. The Whitman estate includes claims to copper, gold, and silver deposits across half the territory, claims worth more than $500,000, as my father intended for his son." Johnson's face went white as the full magnitude of his miscalculation hit him. As dawn broke over the valley, the procession made its way back to Millfield. Word had already spread through the town about the night's events, and the entire population had gathered in the main street. The mood was somber, ashamed. Mayor Hutchins stepped forward as the column approached. "Colonel Whitman," he began formally, "on behalf of Millfield, I want to apologize for our treatment of Mr. Weatherby. We didn't understand." "You understood perfectly," Robert replied sternly. "You understood that an old man was risking his life to protect an innocent young woman. You simply chose cowardice over courage." Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "Sam," she called out, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what we said, what we thought. When I got home last night and thought about what you'd done, what kind of man you are, I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you. You sent the telegram, Sam said simply. She nodded. I remembered you mentioning Colonel Whitman years ago, about serving under him. I took a chance that if this girl really was connected to that family, someone would be looking for her. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, stepped forward. Sam, we were wrong. All of us. We let fear make us forget what this town is supposed to stand for. What any decent place should stand for, added Doc Morrison, who had emerged from his office where he'd been treating Johnson's wounded men. Justice, protection of the innocent, standing up for what's right. Clara Webb, the schoolteacher, addressed Grace directly. Miss Whitman, I want you to know that you'll always have a place here in Millfield, if you choose to stay. We need to remember what real courage looks like. Grace looked around at the faces of the people who had just hours before been willing to sacrifice her to save themselves, but she also saw genuine remorse and the possibility of redemption. I think, she said quietly, that Millfield is exactly the kind of place my father would have wanted me to call home, especially with people like Mr. Weatherby, to remind everyone what honor means. Colonel Whitman placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. Mr. Weatherby, my family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Grace is the last of the Whitman line, and you've given her back to us. I didn't do anything special, Sam said, uncomfortable with the attention. Just what any decent man would do. That, Robert replied, is exactly what made it special. As the sun climbed higher over Millfield, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Sam Weatherby sat on his porch with Grace Whitman beside him. Boss Johnson and his surviving men were on their way to territorial prison, and the town was already talking about ways to honor the man they had so recently mocked. What will you do now? Sam asked Grace. Uncle Robert wants me to come to Santa Fe to learn about managing the estate, she replied, but I think I'd like to spend some time here first, learn about the father I never really knew, about the man who was brave enough to stand up for what's right. Your father was a good man, Sam said, made some hard choices, but he never forgot who he was inside. Grace smiled, watching the town bustle with activity as people went about their daily business. But there was a difference now, a sense of purpose, of community that had been missing before. Sam, she said softly, thank you, not just for saving my life, but for showing me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. Yes, miss, Sam replied, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile. I reckon they are. And in that moment, as the frontier town of Millfield went about the business of becoming a place worthy of its name, Sam Weatherby knew that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing really could change everything.